Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to this EMIC webinar, part two of Bridging Minds, the Transformative Power of Digital Storytelling in Mental Health Care. For regular attendees, you will know who I am, but for those who are new here, my name is Fiona Costello. I'm based in the UK and have the fabulous job of moderating the EMIC webinars. In our October discussion, we explored the incredible potential of digital storytelling to connect clinical knowledge with real-life experiences, shedding light on its role in humanizing mental health care. We talked about creating spaces where individuals with mental health feel safe, feel seen, and feel supported. Today, our lovely panelists, Chika, Hayley, Ryan, and Asante, have come back to build on that foundation. Our session will focus on the unique power of storytelling, not just as a tool for understanding mental health, but as a means of creating safer, more compassionate spaces that empower both individuals and systems. As with the last session, we will be deviating away from the presentation formats and engaging in a conversation, telling stories and unpacking key themes from our last conversation. We'll address questions we didn't get to and explore new insights into how storytelling can transform mental health care. You'll hear from each of our speakers soon, but first, and as ever, I have a few quick points to mention. So first and foremost, please feel free to share your current location or area of interest. To do so, you can click on the three dots next to your name tag, choose edit and add your country or area. This allows you to connect with others who share similar interests. If you have any questions for the panelists during the webinar, please feel free to post them in the chat box. If people are saying things as we're conversing, please do engage and send in your comments or your questions, and I will do my very best to include as many of them as possible in our discussion. And lastly, again, as always, today's webinar is being recorded and the EMIC team will soon share the recording in the Knowledge Bank. So for those of you unable to join the first session, I'd like to start by inviting our panelists back into the webinar, and we'll begin. We got Chika. Okay, I'm sure she's coming through. So Hayley, I know I would like you to start by taking the floor and introducing yourself, and if our other lovely panelists can do a quick introduction, and then we'll let you do a bit of a recap on Unsinkable before we get into it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Fiona. My name is Hayley Heckman. I am the Executive Director at Unsinkable, and I am so glad to be here this afternoon for myself, joining you for this part two of our conversation around storytelling and mental health. And I will pass it over to Asante.
Thank you so much, Hayley. My name is tripping over my name. My name is Asante Houghton, and I'm the manager of storytelling at Unsinkable. Interested in all things stories, all things social justice, mental health, equity, etc. That's my vibe. Anyway, enough for me. I will toss it over to Ryan.
Hello, my name's Ryan Forsyth. I'm an award-winning mental health speaker and advocate from Ottawa, Ontario. I specialize and really have an interest in men's mental health and healthy masculinity, and I'm also an Unsinkable community champion for the last 5 years with Asante and Hayley and Chika. So, Chika, I'll pass it over to you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Chika Riwa. I am a resident in psychiatry at the University of Toronto, and I am also a proud board member of Unsinkable and have been on this team since the summer. So newest to the organization, but feel very honored to be able to create as much impact as we've been able to do in the last several months. And so I'm very passionate about stories. I'm also an author. I am a writer, public speaker, and just really, really proud champion of Unsinkable. So excited for today's conversation.
Over to me.
Yeah.
Unless you want to go ahead, Fiona.
No, I was literally going to say thank you very much. We are so genuinely so thrilled to have you back. The last session was incredible. So I'm really excited about getting back into it again today.
Thank you. Same here. So last session, we did much more of an in-depth overview around our work at Unsinkable. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out, feel free to go back and watch the recording from part 1. But I won't belabor that this afternoon, but I do want to share with you just a brief video showcasing our impact over the course of 2024 to give you a taste of the work that we do at Unsinkable. So I'm just going to share my screen. Yep. Understand different insights into how we can support people to access different resources. It's
Unsinkable has been built on this idea of going together.
That that men can experience a variety of emotions.
Listen without any judgment. Show kindness and empathy.
Evening and welcome to Unsinkable's first of many to come fireside chat series.
It's just been a terrific journey so far, and I can't wait to see what we'll accomplish in the future.
Thank you. Thanks, Hayley. I always feel really moved seeing videos like that and seeing a year of progression and a year of really making an impact. I always think it's incredibly special, and especially at this time of year as we head into 2025. So to all panelists, as we established in our previous session, storytelling is a really powerful tool in mental health care. To ground today's session, could each of you share how you incorporate storytelling into your work again and the impact that you have seen from sharing your story? Hayley, if you go first.
Sure. So for me, as a leader at Unsinkable, I feel that it's critical that I role model what it means to openly and authentically share my own story. I actually initially connected with Unsinkable as a storyteller in late 2022. I shared my personal journey navigating an eating disorder throughout my 20s. And I found just this level of empowerment in being open and honest, not only about my lived experience, but being a support system for others who had similar lived experience that could see themselves reflected back through me. I'm constantly incorporating my personal story into the way that I work, whether it's connecting with community partners, whether it's sharing our work with other organizations, whether it's connecting with my team. I think being able to build trust with the team that we have that is mostly comprised of people with their own lived experience is so critical. Building trust with our stakeholders and thinking about the way that we design programming. Storytelling is involved in all aspects of the work that I do. I feel like when it comes to the impact of story for me, both personally and professionally, there's been so many, but the biggest one that comes to mind is the door that it opened with my family. I think there were things that I was able to express in my story publicly that I would have had a really hard time sitting down and having a conversation about with people closest to me. And so being able to share my story on a platform like Unsinkable and then use that as a prompt for conversation with the people in my life actually was really helpful. And I noticed, the questions that I received came with so much more compassion because there was some context to draw from, because there was an opportunity to see me through a different lens before diving into what felt like a very emotional discussion on topics that we might maybe never would have covered otherwise. And one of the biggest outcomes of that process for me was seeing my mom share her story, that it gave her permission to feel more comfortable opening up to me. And then ultimately she also shared her story publicly. So I feel really passionate about not only the way that story can inspire an audience, but also the way that it gives courage to storytellers to feel more and more confident being open and authentic with who they are.
That was a terrific answer, Haley. I'll jump in really quick. A lot of what you said resonated with me. The stuff about family. Definitely, when I started sharing my story, my family started to engage with me in a way, in a much different way than before. Whereas if I was to talk to them directly, sometimes it would lead to conflict. But hearing, my story, almost like from this external standpoint, I think gave them the distance to be able to sort of see the things that maybe I had been trying to express. But going back to the crux of the question, how does storytelling interact with my work? Well, I'm the manager of storytelling at Unsinkable, so in a lot of ways, but I want to really frame it from a perspective of leadership and team building. Um, one of the things that I really like to do whenever I'm, starting new relationships with a new team or new partners or etc., is to start off by getting to know each other a little bit and not sort of like, just like what are your hobbies, but like the actual person. And I tend to be the first to do the sharing because I find that sharing gives people permission to share and to be themselves and to be vulnerable and to be all the things that I think we want to create in our workspaces. We often talk about we want these workspaces that feel more human, or these workspaces that feel like we can bring more of ourselves to them, because then it creates connection and safety. But I also think beyond that, on like even a professional level, um, when folks know each other, it becomes easier. And here's my barometer for good teamwork: it becomes easier to disagree respectfully. Um, which I think is really important on a team when you really are trying to build, because when when we have meetings and we propose a new idea or we produce something, it's really good to be able to have that honest feedback so the team is able to develop the best offering possible. But if we're not in a position where we have that trust and that comfort, then it's difficult to do that, or more difficult to do that. And I find that storytelling is a great way to set the tone on a team, where folks then feel comfortable enough with each other to be like, hey, I know you, you know me, we kind of know what makes each other tick, that kind of thing. So we can trust that things are not personal when we are discussing the work, and still come together and be a work family afterwards. So for me, that's a big way that I try to bring storytelling into my work.
For me, it's interesting because I don't work in mental health. I work in radio. I work in media, and I fell into this sort of line of work because I shared my story one day online in a digital format with the story of my suicide attempt. And what I learned from that experience is that not only did it help me, right? We all know that talking about the things that happened really sort of um, like it frees that from us, but how much it touched other people in my life, but complete strangers on the internet. And so throughout my life, as I first shared my story and started to grow even more and more in my work and my knowledge, I'm still not a mental health expert. I've never went to school for this. I don't do it in my day-to-day professional life. So what I try to do is intertwine my own story, the things I've learned along the way and how I've learned them, listening to other people's stories and other people tell me things. And for me, it's like that's what it's all about, because that to me is what like stories is being human. And you don't have to go to school to understand things like empathy, and you don't have to uh, go and get a degree in something in order to understand other people and their experiences. And I think that was just really important. And how I try to always do it is be like, hey, I might tell you something like, you know, the patriarchy hurts men, but here's the story that goes along with that, how I sort of learned that, and how I fell into being able to share this information with you. And I think that's just really important, to really humanize the information as well, instead of just being thrown sort of terms and statistics and making it sound a little stuffy. When you can add that story, it really helps humanize it in a way, and makes it accessible for other people to understand.
So I have the great pleasure of following these three incredible individuals, and I've actually been taking notes of some of their responses because I feel like it just so beautifully epitomizes and illustrates the power of storytelling, because I feel like I can relate in some ways to each of their stories. But I'll start a little bit with my own, with that telling stories is as organic for me as breathing and writing. So I am a poet, I'm a writer, I'm also a physician, and that ties back into storytelling for me. But in my life outside of medicine, as someone who does public speaking professionally, and as someone who just wrote a memoir where I talk very candidly about my experiences as it pertains to mental health and other formative type events, but being that, storytelling and performing and writing and creating and just telling my story with a lot of dexterity is so core to who I am outside of my trained profession in medicine. But within medicine, as a psychiatry resident, as a future psychiatrist, being able to share my personal stories actually, I believe, enables me to connect better with my patients. It humanizes me. So tying back to what Ryan said, saying that stories are about being human. You're absolutely right. And I think actually what makes me the best doctor is not the decade of training that goes into becoming a psychiatrist post-secondary, but what actually makes me the best doctor is connecting back to my humanity. An element that ironically is a little bit beaten out of you throughout the course of medical school and medical training. You lose your humanity quite a lot. And so I think what makes me the best doctor is actually staying true to my humanity, and storytelling enables me to do that. Tying back to Haley's point where she shared her experiences with disordered eating, I too talk very candidly about my experiences with disordered eating in my memoir. That was something that Haley and I were able to connect very deeply about just a couple of months ago. And really, how that also enabled me to get closer to my family. And so piggybacking off of what Asante said, where he said that it was easier almost to connect back to those that you love, or to have these hard conversations when you're doing it with a little bit of distance through the form of storytelling. So that was very true for me as well. Being able to discuss some of the harder elements of my disordered eating, or my struggles with depression and anxiety within medical school and leading up to medical school. These are discussions that are so taboo in an African household and in other cultures and households, I'm sure. But truly for me, being able to express myself through poetry, I found was the most transcendent form of storytelling that I could provide. And that enabled me to have these really hard conversations And, also owing to what Asante says, vulnerability is the basis of all relationships. And in a professional capacity, when you're able to tap into that vulnerability, it begets more vulnerability. So you're inviting other individuals into that space. And that is your superpower as a leader, as a professional, and in any capacity when you're working with other individuals. So that's just my thoughts on that question.
I'm always struck by hearing the four of you speak about so passionately and so candidly about your own experiences and how you've marshaled that and harnessed that to connect with others. It's truly inspiring. And we talk a lot about, I think, in the last session as well, about authenticity and it allowing you to meet people where they are, rather than putting in barriers and boundaries. And on the subject of kind of barriers and boundaries, Asante, you've often highlighted the need to balance storytelling with data in mental health care. How do you see personal narratives complementing or even transforming the way we interpret mental health statistics? Because you see a lot of statistics around mental health. It often shapes the public discourse, the public narrative, but actually behind every statistic, there is a person. So I think this is such an important question.
And I think what you said at the end there is a huge part of it. Is behind every statistic is a person. We are not data points. We're people with full lives and full experiences. And then when we think about the role of research, we do it, especially when we think about research with humans. We do it to solve problems to improve humans' lives. And we have a better sense of what those lives look like and what the challenges that we are trying to solve look like if we have the stories to go with the data. That is, the stories are really the things that contextualize the data. Of course, the numbers, they could point you in a direction and give you a bit of a picture. But I find that it's really the stories that drive things home and really allow us to understand what is happening, between these numbers and how we can connect the dots and the directions in which we can go to then start finding solutions. I also think that storytelling within data also, when we do it, what that means is that we are engaging with the population from which we are drawing the data, which is really important. Too often in research, we find this thing where researchers are interacting with the population, and sort of like, taking this data from them, and then that population doesn't really feel like they were meaningfully engaged in that research. So, if we have stories involved, there is at least an indication that there has been some level of engagement. But I think overall, for me, it's just about contextualizing what the data can mean so the data can be more useful. On another level, it shows respect to the people who are providing the data as well, and just gives all of us a clearer picture of, what, needs and desires and challenges and hopes and dreams and all of these different pieces comprise these data points. So I'm huge on the qualitative aspect of things. And I think it's necessary in order for us to get a full picture of what's really going on.
I, I mean, yeah, I mean, hearing you speak about it, it seems almost blindingly obvious, doesn't it, that a statistic 1 in 4, there is so much underneath that needs attention, intersectionality with different social determinants of health and well-being just being one aspect of that, and then how that influences mental health, how that influences provision, how that influences you as a recipient of information. I think, when we think about the audience in EMIC, that's probably something that will really strike true when we think about some of the service managers responsible for looking after their populations and advocating for their populations. And to do a good job of advocacy, you have to really understand stories. Chica, as a physician, you've been trained to maintain a certain professional distance, often avoiding showing vulnerability. In a profession with high rates of mental illness and burnout, and that we as a society have probably become more aware of in recent years, I would suggest after COVID, how do you navigate the challenge of sharing your personal experiences and identify as a storyteller, particularly in such a public way? And how do you think showcasing your own struggles can help normalize discussions around doctors being human, fallible, and susceptible to the same mental health challenges as others?
So, this is a brilliant question because I have absolutely faced a little bit of that stigma as well when as it pertains to being vulnerable as a physician. As you mentioned, it is so truly baked into our culture in medicine to be almost stoic in a way, to attach just enough to our patients so that we are perceived as compassionate and caring and genuine, but then also detach quickly enough so that we don't like take on their traumas, and that we're able to stay within the right mindset. So there is this element, as I mentioned before, that we are trained to be dehumanized in some context so that we are able to operate at these levels. But an element of that is that physicians are also perceived to be superhuman in the way that we shouldn't be individuals who experience any kind of mental health challenges. And so when I was actually on my book tour promoting my memoir, Unlike the Rest, I was asked by one of the media individuals whether I carried this shame, or like how is it that I could have been a medical student studying about how to nurture my body and at the same time be struggling with restrictive eating as though it was something I deliberately wanted for myself or was even conscious that it was truly transpiring in that way. And so I think that so much of the power, when we take the power back in our narratives, when we are the ones who are able to define who we are and what our story has been, it actually liberates us from the shame. And I talk a lot about this idea of shedding the shame, because that is truly when we are able to step into our authenticity. That's when we realize our strength, our power, and also recognizing that my greatest superpowers is actually being able to lean into my vulnerability, to discuss these things openly, and to not carry that shame with me. And I think that when I do that, it also invites my patients to be able to come to me candidly, transparently. It really does improve the healthcare, because a lot of individuals will not share things with their doctors out of shame. They will not share things with their doctors out of fear of being judged for something, especially in a mental health capacity. If someone is struggling, say, for example, with suicidal ideation, even if it's, passive or active suicidal ideation, that can be something that carries so much shame that when we ask them candidly, are you having thoughts of harming yourself or harming those around you? Someone would feel so terrified that they would not want to share that themselves. And then that significantly impacts patient care. Because if they think, I don't want this person to judge me, how can this doctor possibly relate to something that I'm experiencing? They have no idea what it's like to struggle. Then that impacts patient care. So I actually think that this is the greatest act of service that I can give to my patients, back to the community, is letting them know just how human I am. All of the things that I have struggled with, all of the ways in which I am infallible as well, admitting what my failures have been, admitting how it is that I have grown from them, and the ways in which I continue to struggle with different things. And so I think that that honestly is our greatest superpower as leaders, as humans, as physicians, as doctors. That's what we should be leaning into, and that's what I am hoping to do through telling my story in the different ways in which I share my story. I think you're on mute,
It's such
Fiona.
an, I know. So it's such an inspiring message, Shiga. I'm always blown away by the way you describe how you see your role and how you see your role as a professional, but also the trust and confidence that inspires in patients and people with lived and living experience to trust services and engage with services where those barriers may prevent them otherwise. And I think, again, it's such an important point of reflection for us as a sector in mental health, because that's what we are all here to do, to make people's lives better and to be that support and that guiding hand. Hayley, a strengths-based approach focuses on individual strengths, abilities, and potential rather than their weaknesses or deficits. How do you see storytelling as a strength-based practice, and how can this help us reimagine how we support those navigating the mental health care system?
So, first of all, thank you, Chica. I just am always so incredibly moved by anything you ever say. So I'm just taking a moment to appreciate that at the right now. So for me, just to give everyone a clear understanding of what a strength-based approach is, it's when we emphasize our internal strengths and resourcefulness rather than our weaknesses and our failures and shortcomings. And so for me, storytelling is the ultimate strength-based approach, both for the storyteller and for the receiver, for the audience. For the storyteller, it's a chance, like Chica was saying, to reimagine your story through a different lens, guided by your resilience and your strength and a recognition that you've overcome a number of challenges. I think it's a chance for us to identify healing in places or at times in your life where in the moment you would not have ever expected yourself to overcome or to work through or to be in the place where you are now. That opportunity to go back in time and look at yourself from that vantage point is incredibly empowering and is an opportunity to see strengths that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to notice in the moment. I think it's also an opportunity to give yourself grace for mistakes that you've made along the way. It's an opportunity for us to implement a self-reflective practice and to really, going forward, be able to take a pause and look at, okay, I'm in this moment right now. I can see from my history that I've been in difficult situations previously. I know that moving forward, I have these strategies, I have these strengths, I have these capabilities within myself to move forward. And for me, I think, when I had the opportunity to share my story for the first time and reflect on it, I was able to see this human that I wasn't able to see fully in the moment. I think, like Chica was mentioning, there's a lot of shame that comes around struggling with our mental health. There's a lot of blame that we put on ourselves for how we're feeling or the symptoms that we might be navigating or the circumstances that we're working through. And so by giving ourselves that self-compassion of retrospect and being able to say, actually, I was so much more capable in that moment than I gave myself credit for. And here I am. I think that's the ultimate act of a strength-based approach. I think on the other side, for the receiver, for the audience, it's an opportunity to have your own experiences mirrored back to you in the form of a strength. If you can look at someone else's story and the struggles that they went through and see the beauty and the compassion and the strength in them, then it gives you an opportunity to take a moment and say, if I can see all of those positive qualities in another person, can I turn that around and look at it towards myself? I think it builds a level of self-compassion. And then on the flip side, it also builds compassion towards other people. I think, to Asante's point earlier around data, the more we understand someone, the more empathy we're able to cultivate. If we have biases and preconceived notions about how someone ended up in the situation that they're in, and we've written the story for them, it's so much easier for us to discount someone else, or for us to say we have nothing in common, or for us to assume their experiences, their choices. But the more we have an opportunity to listen to stories, the more we're able to cultivate that sense of compassion for one another and have difficult conversations around our shared humanity. I think if we look at anyone's story, everyone is seeking the same things. Everyone's seeking a sense of safety. Everyone's seeking a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose. And the more we can share real human stories in an authentic way, the more we see strength in other people and the more we can reflect that back to ourselves. So that's how I see the strength-based practice. I think when it comes to using that within the mental health care system for providers and for policymakers, it gives you an opportunity to see people through a different light. It reduces our view of differences and challenges and focuses more on understanding lived experience. And it gives you a chance to see someone with lived experience sharing their story as a teacher that can help to inform your decisions when it comes to how you implement your services or how we navigate systems change or how we make decisions. If I understand this person is coming from this place of knowledge, of deep self-wisdom, I can also use that as a really great barometer to help inform decisions that I make as a leader, as a policymaker, as someone working in this space. So I think it's an incredibly important tool and certainly a way for us to address some of the key challenges that are so easy from 6,000 feet away to make a whole bunch of stories about, versus taking the opportunity to hear stories directly from the voices of those who have that experience.
Thanks, Hayley. I think the power of what you describe, when you think about medical practice, things like clinical supervision, reflective praxis, if you think about in a role, you have professional personal development plans. The idea of applying those concepts of reflection in a safe way and to kind of give yourself grace, as you said, I think again are really, really powerful concepts. And I think to an extent, we probably all do it to a degree anyway. But rather than being a kind voice, we probably are an angry voice saying, we shouldn't have done this, we should have done this, this, and this, and you regret, and we need to sort of teach the way to turn that on its head. And to kind of think of that as actually there's a power in it in its own right. Ryan, for those considering sharing their stories publicly, what key practices would you recommend to ensure they feel empowered rather than exposed?
Yeah, I love this question because I also work in social media. And one of the best things about sharing your story digitally is um, it takes away a lot of the sort of middle person in terms of whose story gets told. So there's tons of accessibility, it comes from first person. There's lots of reasons that it's great, but like anyone, you can hear anyone's story, you also open yourself up to feedback from every single person. And when we shared stories, whether it be the book or on the radio or through the TV, it's generally one-sided. But when you do it digitally, it's more two-way, right? They have more access to you. They're freer to lend their feedback. And so the one of the key things I can do is plan what you want to say in advance. um, Not everything needs to be shared about your life. It's one of the mistakes I made very early on by being so authentic in sharing that I started taking away pieces of myself that maybe should have stayed private, that other people shouldn't have had access to and maybe took advantage of. And so if you want to plan your story, a lot of people, particularly young people, forget there is a digital footprint that you leave behind with anything you post or say. And so you want to protect that in case down the road, you don't want to have regrets being like, I shouldn't have shared that story. I shouldn't have shared that feeling. Maybe it got me in trouble, or I look back and it was insensitive, or it was inappropriate, any of those things. So you really want to have a good plan on what parts of yourself you want to share and what stories you want to share, because you do want to keep things for yourself too. The second I will say is communicate and update the people in your life that this story that might affect. The One of my biggest regrets in my life is when I first shared my story about my suicide attempt, I didn't tell my parents I was going to do that. And they didn't know that happened. So the first time they found out was through a social media post, which really, really sucked. I learned also through relationships and my partners that me sharing things online and how that sort of affected them and our communication, also really important, right? You want to help people. You don't want to upset the people in your life. So make sure you're very upfront. You communicate well in advance before you're sharing things that really might affect them. The third piece I will say is, and it always depends, right? If you're sharing a very personal story, I mean, most of the time you're going to receive mostly support. But if you start getting into the world of maybe politics or certain things, learn that you don't need to take everything personally. So I'll share a very recent example of last week. I got 400,000 views on a TikTok because I was trying to explain that men's mental health and the liberation of women were directly intertwined under patriarchy. And I received lots of hate. I was getting DMs. Someone even made a fake account for my personal life just to harass me on TikTok. So you really have to, depending on what you're sharing and what you want to get into, you need to be prepared for some of that, right? There's people who might be nefarious, bad actors who aren't mentally well themselves and might take what you say and what you do and run with it in other ways. Because once you share that story, it's no longer necessarily your own. And now it's open for interpretation, bending of context, taking things and moving them around. And so those are always things that you have to really consider. And if you're prepared for that, great. And if you're like, nah, I don't want to have to deal with that, it's something you should consider whether this modality or this method of how you're sharing, particularly with social media, is that worth it to you? Is that part of it? And I will say the last point is if you're with sharing it on your own is one thing, but sharing it with an organization, you want to make sure the organization has safeguards in place. That's one of the things I love about Unsinkable is there's a whole process to help you go through all of this. There's comments being monitored, your safety and everything is taken really into consideration with what you're sharing. Um, so you want to make sure that, yeah, and even personally, you can have your own personal safeguards. Maybe you turn off comments. Maybe you have an exit plan, again, depending on the content and the story, that you're like, you know what, this is too much. I'm deleting or I'm archiving and I'm getting out of there. So really, the whole point of it is you just really want to make sure that by sharing your mental health story, you're not going to make your mental health worse. And so you just want to take really a lot of precaution and safety and great care with the things you're going to share digitally and share online, and that you take the people in your life, even at work, maybe depending, all that stuff really into consideration with the stories you're going to choose to share.
Mm. Yeah, I think so much of that makes so much sense. I'm thinking about, again, from an education and empowering people to tell their stories, but also to put in place those safeguards to really understand what it is to tell your story. And I think it's a very nice segue to the next question, actually, Asante. Because I was going to ask you if you could share the core principles of safe storytelling, and for organizations that have joined us, who are inspired by the work of Unsinkable and thinking about their own users or their own public members who might be interacting, how can they create environments that prioritize respect, emotional safety, and self-agency for storytellers?
Yeah, that's it's a really good question. I think that there are a few parts to it. I think there is the culture of the organization. And when I say culture, it's sort of, is this a priority for the organization, generally speaking? The safety aspect. And I think that's really important, that that is not just a thing that we say, or a training that we take, but a way that we show up and practice and think, and in our empathy for those who we serve, and those who we work with, to always have that at the forefront. Is, are we trying to cultivate safety, not just for our storytellers, but for our coworkers, for our leaders, for our reports, for our placement students, for everybody who's involved in the process. I think that creates, this culture where then we're all thinking about it, and then there's that trickle down effect. And then now, when you sort of dive deeper into it, what does safety really mean? Because that in itself is it's a big conversation. And when we think about things like equity and diversity and experiences and history, and contemporary issues and all these different things, we have, safety encompasses all of these parts, of a person and their experience and interactions with the world. I've learned, in my career, that things that are, triggering for one person may not be triggering for another. But it's important that we understand, who might be made uncomfortable or harmed by a particular thing, whether that's an individual or a population, and really, think about, how we put things into the world based on that knowledge. So there's a lot of, um, you know, sort of like work that we have to do, as practitioners, so to speak, uh, in having our own understandings of safety, but also we need to also be learning from the folks that we serve, whether that's our audience, or whether that's the storytellers. We have to learn what is safety for them. And what does that mean? I think everyone at this panel has touched upon it in different ways, whether it's family, whether it's social media, whether it's work. These these are things that, we don't want to impact people's lives in a way that makes, families, work, social media, etc., more difficult for them. And then, not just the storyteller, but the audience as well. I could go on and on and on about this, but, to, I think, sort of wrap it up, it's being really attuned to what the impact of what someone might say have on themselves or someone else. So from the storyteller point of view, are they ready to say the thing that they want to say? And readiness can mean, will they re-trigger themselves if they tell that story? Readiness can mean, what backlash, as Ryan, and I was actually privy to that. I'm sorry that happened to you, man. But the kind of backlash that folks might get by telling their story, whether that backlash is public or whether it's personal. So thinking about things from that level, but then also thinking about the audience. Are we putting things out into the world that might be harmful for people in our audience? And we might say, well, there are 100 people who are going to see this story and only 2 are harmed, but it is our job to protect those 2 that are harmed and to modify the story accordingly. So for me, sort of all of those pieces are the things that I think about when we talk about safety with respect to storytelling, and probably a lot of other stuff that we don't have time to get to today as well.
I know. I was thinking as you were talking that it inspires some really interesting questions about the roles of leaders in organizations and how traditional mechanisms for organizational delivery, policies, procedures, processes, protocols, how they can be responsive and adapt to people's stories while still creating that systematic structure that they're designed to, and how you kind of create. Because as you were talking, I was thinking about, for example, if you have a particularly diverse workforce and have to be particularly respectful to different viewpoints that at times may clash, and how you create that safe space to enable that to be, I suppose, rather than one being wrong or one being right, but instead it being a safe space, and you recognize that because you observe other people's stories. I think it's from an organizational psychology perspective, I think that's a really interesting topic in its own right. And I think now I'm getting a bit waylaid, Asante. Thank you so much. Chika, what advice would you give to healthcare professionals who want to share personal experiences to normalize mental health discussions without compromising their professional boundaries?
So that's a great question. I would say that the first thing that we have to be mindful of are our professional boundaries, and recognizing what is asked of us professionally when we are representing our profession, but also our institution when we get online. And I think it's important, and we often see this, that most physicians who are engaging in social media will say, I'm not providing direct medical advice, or I'm holding that professional boundary. So like declaring what it is that your professional boundaries are when you're engaging in social media is really important. And I know that I have had to do that myself similarly. I think what else is important is being aware and being informed as to what the guidelines state around social media and what it is that your professions are. So I am based in Toronto, within Ontario, and there are specific guidelines as outlined by the governing body for physicians within Ontario as to what is appropriate for social media and what is not appropriate. And that often ties back directly to our professional responsibilities as it pertains to patient confidentiality and things of that nature. So when I was writing my memoir and I was talking about my experiences in medicine and through my medical training and how that impacted my mental health, I was sharing that story, but I was very cognizant of ensuring that I was still upholding the standards of my profession, such that I was maintaining patient confidentiality. I was ensuring that I was still representing the profession well. And so these are things to be mindful of for any physician or any healthcare provider who wants to share their stories, that they're mindful of the professionalism boundaries, that they declare it if they feel that it's necessary, and that they are still at the same time able to be authentic with how it is that they are sharing the story. And that in some ways does push back against some of the, I would say, like the hidden coded language, the hidden rules around what it means to be a physician. So I know that for myself, like, medicine is such a conservative field, that even the idea of doctors having a social media presence, like that has spooked a lot of residency programs and different hospitals, and they've had to, kind of running around with their hair on fire, like, what are we supposed to do with these doctors that are like quasi influencers? Like, what does this mean? Are you allowed to have that? And I think that the world of medicine is starting to open its eyes and arms to that a little bit more, such that I know that certain medical institutions now have pathways of like creative professional activities where you can actually, put this on your resume, and it can be seen as something that could advance your career if you have a more creative way of engaging in advocacy and engaging in professionalism, which is very new. Like in the last like 5 to 10 years, this is a new thing, but I think our profession is recognizing that there is real value in having public facing doctors and public facing healthcare professionals that are doing work in different ways that can still be done professional, like within the professional boundaries. But as I mentioned before, there is still this element of pushing the envelope in some way. So, when I opened up and when I talked about my experiences with disordered eating as a doctor, that is a very unconventional, untraditional thing that a doctor would do. And I realized that when I shared this story, and I was getting so many questions of, but how can a doctor talk about these things? Like we didn't know that, it was okay for you to talk about that. And in some ways, I'm sure there are maybe, older generations of physicians who would say, I can't believe you would share that information. You should have never shared that information. But as I said, like, I do think it is incumbent upon the newest generation. I certainly feel like it's incumbent upon me to challenge some of these archaic, you know, archetypes of doctors. We have to challenge what it means to be a physician. And so I think that showing up in these authentic spaces and places is really important. And I also wanted to take a second to circle back to something that Ryan had said as well, which is this idea of responsibly sharing your story and um, being mindful of what can come of that. Because I know certainly I have been in that position, sadly, as well, Ryan, where, when you do anything that's public facing, whether or not it's merited, you're going to get some kind of backlash because you have no control over who goes on the internet and decides to troll you or attack you or say different things. So I think that it's also important to be mindful of that as well, because I, as a doctor, I've shared some stories. I've written a lot of articles, I've written a lot of things, and I've had patients come into the emergency department looking for me, and they weren't well, they were very unwell, but they came in specifically looking for me with harmful intent. And that is something that we need to be mindful of as physicians, is that our location, where it is that we are working, that's public knowledge. And so if you're going to share your story, you have to be mindful that people may receive it in any type of way, and you have a certain visibility that you can't get away from. So it's just being mindful of mitigating the potential harms. And I think just to my final point to, responsibly sharing, that was the other thing, is that, social media in some ways it can be this beautiful evil where it can forge these incredible connections with people all over the world, but it could also be really harmful to our own mental health, very toxic. And that's why I'm now playing with this, not even playing with this idea, I'm now diving more into blogging on my website, because it's another way of being able to share my story that other people can receive without necessarily creating this forum of public opinion. And it's like, I can just share the story, and it is now a blog post, and people can come and they can visit it, they can read it, they can take things away from it without it being a TikTok or an Instagram or whatever that can just, as Ryan said, spiral way out of control very, very quickly. And then you just lose all autonomy over what should have been your story. So there's some creative ways to somewhat circumvent some of that risk that is inherent to public facing storytelling.
I think again, it's so interesting what you've all described in terms of your experiences of sharing stories, but then also some of those things that you probably don't think about, and then suddenly you're inviting feedback, or you're inviting really negative feedback or comments, and suddenly, to your point, Ryan, that your stories, your own personal experiences don't become your own, rather they become a subject of opinion in the court of public opinion, especially in that kind of social media and online world. And Chica, I think what you've just talked about in terms of that, the blogging, is a really practical, tangible way of starting to take back your power, I guess, in terms of how you share and disseminate your story. And again, I think that'll be very interesting for our audience to consider. So mindful of time, we've got a few minutes left. To all of you, what do you think are the key gaps in mental health care that storytelling can address, and how can we ensure that these efforts are both inclusive and sustainable? I am going to ask, because Chica is in the middle of my screen at the moment, Chica, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the role of storytelling within healthcare, and I think specifically within the role of psychiatry, that there is absolute potential there that I think is honestly untapped, with once again breaking down some of the barriers that are inherent, that are intrinsic between doctor and patient as it pertains to being vulnerable enough in a space to be able to share your story. I honestly do believe that when we share vulnerability, it begets more vulnerability that'll enhance patient care. It'll save lives. And I think that's also the mission of Unsinkable, is that we are saving lives in this capacity. So I think that if we can bake that into the culture of healthcare, of mental health care specifically, we will, as a byproduct, save lives by doing so. So that's my thought.
Ryan?
Yeah, I wanted to first touch on a point because I feel like not that it was negative, it was very real, but knowing that us sharing our stories and how it saves lives and changes lives is exactly why we do it. Because one person being able to receive support because of something we said, um, to me at least, makes everything worth it in my mind. What I will say about the question though is it like Chica just said, it has the power to change lives, and I know that because it has changed my life. Hearing other people share their stories based on their experiences, it has changed my own perspective, not only on myself and mental health, but how my place is in this world as a man and as a straight white man. All those things play into it, and that all comes from storytelling. And the gap that I see is it's accessibility. It gives a voice to every single person in order to share what is meaningful to them. Where me coming from a background in media, particularly with mental illness, there was a very strict depiction of what sort of that might look like. That you have to be this extreme sort of example in order to be receiving therapy and stuff like that. And so by humanizing this and hearing all these different stories and why different people go to therapy for what different reasons, or how, race, gender plays into mental health, like all of that comes from firsthand account stories without a middleman deciding which story is important and which story is not. And so it puts everybody at a point where, okay, now like there's tons of people from this group or this population or this organization that is saying one thing. Let's take that more seriously. Let's bridge that gap that I didn't know any of this. Now you can't say that because the information is all out there based on storytelling. And for me, that's the biggest thing I think we can all take away from it, is now everyone has a voice and we should be listening to those voices. Haley, you haven't spoken in a while. I'll put to you.
Sure. Thank you, Ryan. And so for me, I think the biggest thing that comes to mind when it comes to identifying the gap that storytelling is filling is that mental illness thrives in isolation. It thrives in reminding you that you're alone, that nobody will understand you, that your experiences, that your feelings are yours and yours only. And so storytelling helps to connect people to the idea that there are other people out there who understand your frame of reference. They may not be in the exact same situation, they may not be dealing with the exact same context, but there's a lot of opportunity to relate to lived experience and to see yourself reflected through the eyes of others. And we know that one of the biggest barriers to accessing mental health care is seeing someone that you relate to speak openly about what that meant to them. That it's not an issue of whether or not you can find a phone number or a website. Sometimes the biggest gap between accessing the support you need and where you are right now is hearing someone share that they had a positive experience or that they accessed a particular type of treatment or support. And this is what that looked like. And this is how it resulted in a positive outcome for them. So I think the more that we can tell story, the better. I think to Ryan's point around assumption, no one in my life knew that I was struggling with an eating disorder because I went from a larger body to a smaller body, and societally we congratulate that. And so I received a lot of positive affirmation when I was struggling, saying, how did you do this? And I would love to know your secret, when really I was incredibly in a really bad place. And so I think it also encourages, through storytelling, letting go of our preconceived notions and our assumptions of what certain mental illness or mental health challenges look like, and instead listening to people from their own personal perspective. I think that's so important. And then lastly, making sure as we continue to move forward with this approach that we're hearing the voices of those who often go unheard, that we're taking an intersectional lens to mental health, that we're considering greater context, that we're considering systems that impact certain people more than others, and that we're reflecting that in whose story we share, and creating spaces for people to share openly and creating that level of safety like Asante spoke about earlier.
And speaking of Asante, you're up.
Hey. Um, yeah, I think everything that you have all said so far is, perfect. To add, I think about all of the times I've been to the doctor, regardless of the kind of doctor, whether it was to, fix my ankle or to, support a mental health challenge I was going through. Um, you know, the it always feels rare when I have a chance to tell the story behind what brought me there. Um, so then when we think about healthcare, and before I go into that point, you know, because I was not able to tell my story as to what brought me there, the treatment was not sufficient. Um, and then I had to be treated over and over again, or in one case, tear my Achilles twice to get proper treatment, before I got proper treatment. So anyway, so for me, there is a basic element of we need to hear people's stories so that we can provide the best possible treatment. So from like a healthcare context, because if we're not making space for people to tell, those stories, and I understand, especially within the Canadian context, for those of you who are not Canadian, our healthcare system being publicly funded, means that doctors sometimes have to kind of, shift people in and out of the door really quickly. So I know that's a challenge. But even within that, I think going back to what you have all said, there is an issue of access in the sense of you know what whose stories are important and whose stories are we allowing people, like, are we allowing people to tell their stories based on who we think is important, and the factors that our biases as maybe a healthcare practitioner we're bringing to the table, all these different pieces, and that goes to speak about access. Are we allowing people to have proper access to healthcare if we're not allowing them to tell their stories because we are impacted by our own biases? So there are many layers, I think, to this conversation, but for me it really boils down to, are we providing enough space to tell the entirety of the story that they want to tell in order to get the treatment that they are seeking? And I think for us, it's we are obligated to do the work professionally and personally to make that level of treatment possible, because that's why we are all in this game, is to help people. And if we are not doing the work to help people as much as we can, then I mean, I think we need to take a look at ourselves and reassess, and think about what we can do better.
Very, very powerful words to end on, Asante. We are out of time. I would just like to say a huge thank you to each of our panelists again for coming back and diving into more of the detail. Again, once again, I personally have really enjoyed it, taken a lot from it. You've definitely stimulated my own thinking in terms of my own roles outside. So I am very, very grateful to you all. I have no doubt that an audience engaged with EMIC is in no doubt about the power of stories that at their heart focus on connection, focus on creating safe spaces characterized by empathy, compassion, space, healing, empowerment, and ownership of who you are, what your story is, and how that should influence how you receive care and how you should be with others. It's been my sincere pleasure to host today's session. I thank you again to those of you who are with us. Wherever you are in the world, have a wonderful day, evening, or good night ahead. It is good night in my case. And wishing you all a very happy holiday season and a happy new year. And I can't wait to see you all again in 2025. Thank you very much, everybody.